Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to Studio Korea. I'm Stephen Erper, the Senior Vice President, and we are delighted to have you here with us this evening. We'd also like to welcome all those who are streaming live and our at-home podcast viewers and listeners. For more information and to hear more on our broadcast, please see us at koreasociety.org. It is a pleasure this evening as we roll toward the conclusion of our policy season to have with us one of the senior analysts in the United States on Korea, and who has spent a lifetime on North Korea. That is Bruce Klingner of the Heritage Foundation. Bruce has been a longtime public servant through the U.S. government and his career in intelligence. He also leapt after that into the private sector with both Intellibridge and the Eurasia Group, and he is now with the Heritage Foundation. He has appeared on Capitol Hill and is widely consulted in terms of his opinions on the changes on the peninsula and in Northeast Asia. And this evening he will discuss with us his perspectives on change or lack thereof in North Korea, options in U.S. policy, perhaps what he sees as China and its potential changes or lack thereof. And after a short discussion, we will turn to you, our studio audience, for your insights, comments, and questions for Mr. Klingner. So, Bruce, welcome.
Well,
Great to have you at the Korea Society.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, we're old friends, and it's very nice to have you here at the Korea Society, which dates back to 1957 and General Van Fleet's early effort to educate Americans on Korea. Our policy agenda for this fall has touched largely on strategic risk in the Korean Peninsula, and so we'd welcome your insights in terms of what you feel is really happening or not in terms of changes with North Korea, and how you as a longtime analyst look at those changes and balance the realities to determine really what's happening.
Well, I guess maybe just to start is I've been looking at Korea and Northeast Asia for 20 years, and perhaps things tend to look cyclical. I think when you focus on North Korea for any length of time, you tend to get a bit cynical and skeptical and a bit pessimistic because, in a way, we've seen it all before. I think of two things, though, is when you talked about change, is when Kim Jong-un first came into office right after his father's death, there was a lot of media speculation that this will be different. Because he spent a few years in Switzerland, he will be more open to economic reform, political reform, and moderating North Korea's belligerent behavior. Of course, we've seen Pol Pot, Papadaktivalier, and Syria's Assad all studied in Paris, and that didn't make them any less belligerent. And the other thing I think of was in the beginning of 2013 was because the leaderships in all the Northeast Asian countries were changing, that this would either lead to volatility or major changes in policy. And really, in both cases, we've seen more continuity than change. I remember in 1994, many, including in the U.S. government, predicted that Kim Jong-il would be a bold economic reformer, and North Korea was on the cusp of massive economic reform. Well, that didn't turn out very well. And also, so we've seen Kim Jong-un is just as adverse to reform as his predecessors, no less dangerous or belligerent than his predecessors. And also we've seen really in the U.S. and all the Northeast Asian nations really not much change in policy. So I know it's a bit of a pessimistic view, but I don't foresee much change in 2014. I think with North Korea, we'll see switching back and forth between charm offensives, which we're going through now, and then a return to provocations.
In 2013 will be remembered as an especially eventful year in the sense that perhaps since 2010, the year with the most intense rhetoric, as you pointed out, and the spring was really a time when the international community had great concern. I think it was 26 nights in a row in March and April that the major U.S. media outlets led with the North Korea threat story. And there has been, at least in the opinion of some, a diplomatic softening in recent months. Some people have pointed to the Kaesong Industrial Zone and certain North Korea overtures. Others have said those are equally disappointing. How do you read this year in particular?
Well, it's certainly we've seen really the typical range. We had incredibly high tensions in March and April, and now we're back to a normal status quo. And the strange thing about North Korea is if they only threaten to kill you a few times a day, that's seen as a charm offensive. Or if they use slightly less insulting, belligerent, threatening language, that's seen as a signal of an opening. It's sort of perhaps unique to North Korea. But in March and April, the tension was very high. And the media, particularly in the U.S., focused more on the nuclear threats. So there was sort of this fear that North Korea would launch a nuclear ICBM towards Washington, and that clearly wasn't the real threat. What I was more concerned about was another tactical level clash in the West Sea. We had movements of military forces, long-range artillery closer to the northern limit line. We had Kim Jong-un visiting the northern islands, making very specific threats about the southern islands. And so that was the kind of thing which, when I was in the intelligence community, we'd call a change in the signal-to-noise ratio, that if you see changes in military capabilities, changes in the regime threat level, that's something certainly you have to alert your superiors to. You couldn't guarantee that there would be a clash, but you also couldn't guarantee there wouldn't be one. And along with that, you also had two other factors. One was the far greater uncertainty of Kim Jong-un. We don't know what makes him tick. We don't know if he understands the concepts of red lines, if he knows where to stop. And also in South Korea, after the Cheonan, Lee Myung-bak changed the rules of engagement, made it much more likely that South Korea would respond. They pushed the decision to retaliate to a lower echelon, and they changed a number of the rules of engagement. And Park Geun-hye made very clear that she would respond if there was another attack. So it was much more tense in Seoul with U.S. Forces Korea and in Washington. Now, it didn't obviously escalate to a clash, but it certainly signaled that Kim Jong-un wasn't going to be any different, any more benign than his predecessors.
Well, let's talk about some of the conditioning factors. One would be the consolidation of the regime in North Korea. Do you feel that Kim Jong-un is in control? Are these purging of generals creating potential for dissent? The Guardian this week reported that there may have been, based on a RAND report, a November 2012 assassination attempt. How do you read this?
Well, with North Korea, the internal situation, we're always looking through a glass darkly. So we are reading tea leaves. But I think really the greatest challenge to Kim Jong-un would have been immediately after his father's death. And if we go back a few years earlier, I think had Kim Jong-un died, or I'm sorry, Kim Jong-il died when he had the stroke in August of 2008, who knows what would have happened? There was no formal, at least announced to the outside world, succession plan. There was nothing in the Constitution. Then there might have been a free-for-all trying to grab the brass ring of power. But after his stroke, there was 3 years where they were able to prepare society, the leadership, potential challengers, that Kim Jong-un would be the next anointed one. So right after his death, if there had been a challenge, that's, I think, when it would have occurred. But immediately after the death, we didn't see any indications of challenges. We didn't see signs of confusion. We didn't even see the Revolutionary Council has decided. It was always Kim Jong-un right from the start. And then once he assumed the 6 titles of his father, after each one, it made it harder and harder for a challenger to try to go against, because then he was going against the system and even the Constitution. So I think the longer he was in office, the more likely it was that he was going to survive, and now he's been in office for some time. When we see the purges, we're not sure. It either could be a weak, highly challenged Kim Jong-un trying to fight off yet another wave of a coup or overthrow. I think really it is more a sign of a confident Kim Jong-un who's likely firmly in control, though he doesn't have all the power like his father did. But I think he's likely consolidated it. I think he's in control, and he's confident enough that he can rotate through these military officers. And I think that's part of a broader trend, not only of consolidating, but also shifting the power away from the military, where it was under Kim Jong-il, back to the party, where it was actually under Kim Il-sung.
In terms of replicating the grandfather, there seems to be a lot of that, whether it's the propaganda or the handlers who try to impress. one of the relations that was strong then that may or may not be less so now is that critical relationship with China. Some in the Korean studies community, myself included, have tended to argue that we may be seeing some change, that our Chinese interlocutors in the scholarly community are saying that officials are telling them that there's growing disenchantment under this new leadership in Beijing. But you argue that we're not really seeing any fundamental change. Can you explain that a little bit?
Right. I think the Chinese-North Korean relationship has always been fairly complicated. It's never really been the lips and teeth relationship that the analogy that is overused. The relationship with, even under Kim Il-sung, he played off the Soviet Union and China against each other so that neither one would have as much power over this little North Korean nation as one would expect. The relationship was worse under Kim Jong-il, and I think it's worse still under Kim Jong-un. And I don't think China has the influence that many people think it has over North Korea. There are many things they've tried to get North Korea to do: economic reform, abandoning nuclear programs, not doing nuclear and missile tests, and North Korea has always just rejected those entreaties from Beijing. But if we look at earlier this year, there was a lot of speculation that, especially given the threats North Korea was making in March and April, that China had finally gotten so angry with its ally that it was adopting a tougher policy. Perhaps. But I think the evidence was pretty sketchy. The Bank of China cut off trade with the Foreign Trade Bank of North Korea. It's a good step, long overdue. But actually, Beijing did that in September 2005. Then they resumed it. Non-delivery of fuel oil in February, but also they didn't deliver it in February of the last 2 years as well as other times. And there are a number of other things. The rhetoric is supposedly tougher, but Beijing didn't even single out North Korea for criticism, instead saying no nation should undermine peace and stability. So I think the evidentiary basis is pretty weak, or at least premature, to make a conclusion that Beijing has had anything more than a change of attitude or a change of rhetoric. And actually, there's less discussion in Washington now than there was earlier this year about Beijing making a change. And it may have been when North Korea was really acting badly and making very strong threats in March and April. China was nervous and I think very angry. So they were ratcheting up the rhetoric. Now that North Korea is doing the charm offensive, we see Beijing going back to let's all return to the six-party talks rhetoric. So if there was a change, I think it was a very small tactical change or incremental change, and now either they've come back to center, or it's not something that we're seeing a lot of pressure by China on North Korea. I hope I'm wrong, but we're not seeing a lot right now.
We discussed the threat levels earlier in the year following the nuclear test and the missile test. And about 6 months ago, we had an important set of bilaterals. We had the meeting between President Park Geun-hye and President Barack Obama. We had a visit out in Sunnylands between President Obama and President Xi Jinping. And then we also had a visit by President Park Geun-hye to President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Three very important sets of meetings, and perhaps you saw those as optimistic or overly optimistic. One of the things I might suggest is there did appear to be closer coordination on the denuclearization issue. How do you read that, and how do you read the longer-term prospects of Sino-U.S. cooperation or difference in terms of their outlooks toward the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think all three of those meetings were very important. Unfortunately, there wasn't a fourth meeting of Park Geun-hye and Shinzo Abe. And actually, the tense relations between South Korea and Japan is actually a major issue in Washington right now. Even though we're all in agreement on the need to denuclearize North Korea, the tension between our two closest allies in Northeast Asia is a source of concern in Washington. We feel it is undermining U.S. security objectives and U.S. national interests in Northeast Asia. But setting that aside, again, we have, I think, a very close, not only coordination, but agreement between Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington on the nature of the North Korean threat and the need to maintain principles including North Korea must make some preconditional steps before any of us are willing to go back to talks. China has said it's in favor of denuclearization. That was touted by Washington as a major step forward. Of course, all 6 parties agreed to that September 2005. What was striking is after the summits, the U.S.-China and the China-South Korean summits, was a difference in how both the U.S. and South Korea depicted what China had agreed to and what China depicted they had agreed to. Beijing, at least in their public statements, agreed to far less. Maybe that's just their public persona, or the U.S. and South Korea were perhaps a little overly optimistic in what they thought China had agreed to.
Mm-hmm. But Bruce, I guess I'm led to ask you, bottom line, what's in it for Beijing? Isn't Seoul the partner that will be the future for China? And what is there in terms of Pyongyang and North Korea's offering that is of real durability?
No, that's a very good point. And actually what we've seen in China for several years now, and it plays out mostly amongst the state-sponsored think tanks, that's where we see it publicly, is really a division amongst the Chinese academics, the experts, and also the government, including the Central Committee, as to China's policy towards the 2 Koreas. There's, if you want to say old school and new school, the old school, which still seems to outvote the new school, they would point to the Korean War, the alliance forged in blood, socialist brethren, formal allies, that China must support North Korea against the outside threats. It's a buffer, all sort of the traditional arguments. The younger school, the new school, would say China's future on the Korean Peninsula is with South Korea. That is where China will get the economic wherewithal, the economic benefits to feed its own economy to grow at a rate sufficient to maintain political stability against any kind of social unrest due to deteriorating economic conditions. We see that clash. We see that disagreement, dispute amongst the experts and the government. But so far, Beijing seems to be more sort of the traditional, North Korea is our ally. We may not like them. We certainly don't like what they're doing, but we have to protect and support them against international sanctions or anything that could threaten regime stability.
Let me ask you then, before turning to our studio audience, what do you think in terms of the challenge of Trustpolitik as Park Geun-hye's administration is trying to define that, to move forward, to engage, whether it's on Kaesong or other issues, to show a certain willingness to engage, versus what you've described in terms of no real change and a more belligerent tone? How, as an outside observer, do you see that road ahead for some?
I think it's a very good policy. Now, I think there's actually far greater continuity between her policy and Lee Myung-bak's than she and her administration are willing to admit, because her policy, like Lee Myung-bak's, offered a long laundry list of benefits that North Korea could enjoy if they simply begin to abide by the commitments of the many, many international agreements that they've signed. So it really is a 2-track policy of trying to reach out to North Korea, but also maintaining principles of reciprocity, transparency, and conditionality. And then also, as she always affirms, the first pillar of her policy is having sufficient defensive capabilities to deter or, if necessary, defeat another North Korean provocation, whether it's tactical or strategic. So I think it's a well-balanced, I think it's a principled and pragmatic policy, but as she has said, it takes 2 hands to clap. So she has tried to reach out on Kaesong, on separated families, on other issues where she's identified that there are a number of benefits North Korea could have. But she is also emphasizing that trust building is a step-by-step. It's not going to be like the sunshine policy or the peace and prosperity policy of her predecessors. There has to be reciprocal action by North Korea. Now, we can debate whether Kaesong itself is the one step and she'll go no further until reciprocal North Korean action, or whether she'll do that and some other steps, such as the recent announcement that she's willing to have South Korea involved in a Russian project in Najin Songbong. We're not quite sure of the parameters, but she's very principled. She won't go too far down the path of providing benefits without some indication Pyongyang will reciprocate. So I think it's a very good policy, but I think, unfortunately, the stumbling block will be North Korea, and if not a lot of progress is made during the administration, some will blame her. I think, of course, the blame always lays with North Korea and its unwillingness to abide by its commitments.
Thank you, Bruce. We saw you in the Financial Times 2 weeks ago, in the Wall Street Journal Monday, and it's really a pleasure to have you here at the Korea
pleasure being
Society.
here.
Let me turn now to our studio audience. Any questions or comments that might be on your mind?
Bruce, you make it sound as though you're content with the general line the Obama administration takes at the moment as regards North Korea. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you feel is the opportunity or indeed the challenge for Washington in terms of dealing with what seems to be an intractable problem.
Right. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say content with the policy, but I mean, first of all, to describe the U.S. policy, the idea right now is that there's a reluctance to go back to the six-party talks. And if the six-party talks, the sole or the principal objective is to denuclearize North Korea, as long as North Korea says at a very high level, official level statements, we will never, ever, ever give up our nuclear weapons, and they've even changed their constitution, the U.S. sees little benefit to going back to denuclearization talks when North Korea doesn't even give us a 1 in a trillion chance that they are willing to abide by the commitments. So in that sense, the Obama administration also feels that it's tried several times at engagement. Or certainly in 2009, it was even willing to have an unconditional summit. But even before much could happen, North Korea sent a signal that they were going to act just as badly to Obama as they had to George Bush. So the Obama administration felt burned, they felt disappointed, so they adopted, in essence, a much tougher policy on North Korea than even George Bush had ever had. And then when Obama tried again in the Leap Day agreement of last year, you know, that collapsed only 2 weeks later, and again, they felt burned. So I think given the very great respect and trust that the U.S. has for President Park Geun-hye, the U.S. is willing to have her, in essence, be the front runner, to be the one trying to reach out to North Korea, because Obama feels he's tried and it's failed. You know, that said, I think there are things that the U.S. could be doing better. I would have been much more critical of Obama's original policy. It would have been a continuation of the latter term of the Bush administration, giving a lot of concessions and not getting much. Once they switched to a 2 or a 3-track policy, conditional engagement, punitive measures, and sufficient defenses, I think overall it's generally a good policy. The problem is it's been weakly implemented on all of those tracks. So the Asia pivot, there is no pivot. It's under-resourced, and there were no plans of additional forces to protect ourselves and our allies. Engagement, they feel they've tried. I think the biggest fall through, though, is on sanctions. There's a number of things that the U.S. could be doing that we aren't. We're not using our time away from the table effectively, contrary to the perception that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. It's not. We've put far more sanctions on Iran, which I would argue is one of the reasons Tehran is willing to come back to the talks. There are a number of things we've done to Iran, Burma, Syria that we haven't done to North Korea for whatever reason. So I think the timid incrementalism we've done on the punitive measures have not had sufficient impact on North Korea to try to change their calculus.
Please. Can North Korea change?
I don't see any indications of change. That Kim Jong-un has indicated through his New Year's Day speech, as well as all the other announcements by him or by other officials, that they are reluctant to implement economic reform, political reform, and certainly the threat level we saw earlier this year shows there's no change in the security or the foreign policy. We've had rumors of economic reforms, so-called 628 measures from last year, but the Supreme People's Assembly came and went last September. That's when people thought there would be an announcement, and there hasn't been. But even if North Korea implemented massive Chinese-style economic reform, And we've been waiting for that for at least the 20 years I've been working in North Korea. Even if they did that, another country implemented Chinese-style economic reform, China. And that didn't lead to the political reform that everyone hoped it would, nor did it lead to our being less concerned with China's security policy. So even if we give that North Korea implements economic reform, which I think is questionable, we haven't seen any indication of a lessening of the resistance to opening up their borders to outside influence.
We did have a recent visit 2 weeks ago by the Mongolian president, and it has been pointed out that he was the first visiting head of state since the leadership transition. Mongolia, in some analyst argument, is a more appropriate model given the size of the economic scale and reform and potential trajectory. But I'm wondering if you see any potential models out there. Does Burma or does Mongolia, is there anything that holds an allure to you that could be comparable in terms
Right. We were intrigued by the Mongolian president's visit because there's a common ancestry of Mongolians and Koreans, but he didn't get to meet with Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un seems to have a interesting prioritization of who he meets with. He didn't meet with the Mongolian president. He didn't meet with the Google CEO, but he makes time to meet with Dennis Rodman. We sort of scratch our heads over that. But, I mean, we can point to the Scandinavian model, the Vietnamese model, a number of other economic models, if not the Chinese model, that North Korea could or we hope would pursue. But that requires North Korea to be willing to let loose a little bit the reins of control. And what we've seen under Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un is just this real resistance or even a fear of the contagion of outside influence. There are reports, unconfirmed, that 80 people were executed perhaps simply for watching South Korean movies. We can't confirm it, but it's consistent with previous North Korean behavior of this fear of how the outside world could influence North Korea. So
yeah, and those reports this week are that those were public executions,
right.
That there were indeed meant to be if accurate, a signal to the people, and that leads to the question really then of human rights as well. What you see in terms of any changes in American thinking about the human rights situation, especially given the fact that you have commented on the Commission of Inquiry under the United Nations, and that inquiry is due to be completed in March of 2014. We here at the Korea Society will have an event around that with Frank Januzzi of Amnesty International. But I'd like your take on how you see North Korean human rights and how you think that factors in the broader equation relative to nuclear and missile and other concerns you've mentioned.
Right. I mean, obviously, North Korean human rights violations are arguably, if not demonstrably, the worst in the world. I mean, this is a regime that seems more reminiscent of Nazi Germany or Stalinist Soviet Union than the 21st century. Periodically, we have either reports or a book that comes out, Escape from Camp 14 or others, that awakens the populace to the conditions in North Korea. And I think we have an outrage, a collective outrage, but I question why there isn't more outrage. And where's Hollywood? Where are the protests against North Korean human rights violations, which far exceed really anywhere else in the world? Some of it is a lack of a CNN effect. We can't get into North Korea. We don't have the footage that you would see even in the most repressive Middle East regime, Libya or Egypt, where we had an Arab Spring, but it doesn't seem likely we'll have a Korean autumn because of the tight control that the regime has over the populace and any kind of foreign media. If you look in the policy world, there's sort of a tension in a way between human rights and national security. National security would focus on nuclear weapons and other military threats. Human rights activists, I think, would argue, those are threats, but it's doing nothing. And even if we achieve denuclearization, it's doing nothing to improve the condition of the North Korean people. And so human rights activists would say we need to more tightly involve human rights demands and conditions in even nuclear talks. national security advocates or experts would say, well, we need to focus on the security threats, and it's hard to make North Korea change its human rights conditions. So it's a tension we see, I think, in Washington between, I don't want to say competing interests, but different interests and different priorities. So we obviously need to remove or reduce the security threats. We need to try to improve the human rights conditions in North Korea. But there's, I think, a lot of uncertainty about how you can do that, and can you do both at the same time? It's really a quandary that I think many people grasp or grapple with in Washington.
It's been an important issue for us here at the Korea Society as people who are concerned about the people of Northern Korea. And we have had a range of speakers here at the Society, from those who have been more pro-engagement, who have talked about needs in terms of food need, of potential opening. We've had people who have also argued that there is little sign of change, and that these concerns are really among the starkest in the world, and we need a much better and coordinated response. So we've had a spectrum of queries and answers, and it's all very, very compelling. But I'm wondering what you think the impact of this Commission of Inquiry might be, especially following on the release of Escape from Camp 14. On the day of its release, we actually had the author Blaine Harden and the subject of that book, Shin Dong-hyuk, who appeared in Seoul as the first person to offer testimony to the UN Commission of Inquiry. Will it have enough of a change that perhaps over time there is a more integrated approach? And is there a way to link national security concerns with human rights concerns, with concerns about violations of sanctions or others?
I think the Commission of Inquiry is a very good step by the UN. It I think really is a very stark contrast from the past, when they've just had resolutions which really didn't amount to much. So I'm hoping that the Commission of Inquiry really develops more of an evidentiary basis, more of a legal basis for action against North Korea for its violations, whether it goes to the International Court of Justice or not. I mean, at least by having the UN, I think, take a very large step forward, rather than just resolutions. That this, I think, shows a greater recognition by the United Nations of the human rights violations occurring every day in North Korea. One can debate as to whether it will lead to anything, any action by the UN, which really is the real test. We hope that the Commission will develop such a groundswell of outrage, as well as support for action against North Korea to remedy its human rights violations, that it will, implore the United Nations to actually do something, whether it's take North Korea to the International Court of Justice, or do something more than just in essence, a toothless resolution. So really, the jury is still out on that. The Commission's still going through its inquiry, but I think so far it has done a very good job of evidence seeking and presenting the evidence. The real question, and really the real onus of responsibility, will be on the United Nations as to what do they do when they get that, I think, very damning report against North Korea. Do they just shrug it off? Do they pass a resolution? Or are they finally impelled to take some significant action against North Korea?
Mm-hmm. You had an interesting observation that we talked about in the pre-discussion, which is that sometimes you're frustrated that you see this defined as only a conservative issue in U.S. study circles, whereas the human rights concerns in places like the killing fields in Cambodia, or Milosevic, or Rwanda have often been identified as liberal concerns. And you make an argument that this is really a joint concern, that it's a nonpartisan concern, and we need more attention. I wonder if...
Right. It's, excuse me. I mean, it's not something that's sort of demonstrable, but in many discussions in Washington, what I've gotten is sort of the sense of, I mean, first of all, you question why we don't have the same amount of protests, the same level of protests or involvement by celebrities from Hollywood and elsewhere, against North Korean human rights. But also in discussions, there seems to be this tendency of, if people push for action against North Korean human rights violations, the response often is, oh, you're doing that just to undermine the six-party talks. You're doing that just to undermine engaging North Korea. You're trying to set up roadblocks. That's not true, but it's enough of an opinion that I've received from a number of people, and other colleagues, including very liberal colleagues, have told me they've run into the same thing, is that it seems that North Korean human rights and even Chinese human rights are almost set in a different lane in the road than other human rights, and that it's certainly we've seen that in South Korea, particularly during the progressive administrations, where under Roh Moo-hyun, which was an administration really manned by human rights activists. They had protested the authoritarian regimes in South Korea, and yet once they came in office, they never criticized North Korean human rights. They didn't sign on to the UN annual human rights resolution against North Korea because they feared it would undermine engaging North Korea. So I think in South Korea particularly, we've seen a resistance by the progressives against identifying and really condemning North Korea for its human rights violations. So we hope we can see a change.
We've just had in South Korea's ambassador on human rights, Lee Jung-hoon, who talked about that balance of concerns and domestic issues with what he termed a much broader concern for human rights issues globally, and that it needs to be seen in that context. So that's very consistent with what you're saying, and it's a very appealing approach. I wonder, lastly, if you could offer some thoughts on one of the hot topics in Washington, which has been the negotiations with Tehran. And I saw in the journal it was sort of Pyongyang's lessons for Tehran, but I'm wondering if we couldn't reverse that a bit and say, does the process of negotiation with Tehran provide any type of opening or potential in terms of negotiations with North Korea? Are there other lessons, whether it's Syria or Iran, that we need to keep in mind relative to North Korea?
Right. Iran and North Korea are often linked together, if nothing else, in media interviews. We know there's been a decades-long military relationship between Pyongyang and Tehran. Pyongyang sold missiles. We know there's involvement in nuclear programs, and it's a give and take. It's a two-way street exchange of blueprints, components, technology, et cetera. And also, let's not forget, North Korea was involved in the Syrian nuclear reactor that the Israelis bombed in 2007, which some say was partially funded by Iran. So we know there's that relationship. Whether they compare notes on how to best defeat U.S. or UN initiatives, we don't know. But I think if nothing else, they're reading the press about the other country. But and I think when we see an initiative towards either one of those countries, we need to keep in mind the lessons learned from the negotiations with the other. So as now, if excuse me, if Iran seems to be on the fast track, we shouldn't be wary of talking, but we do need to remember the lessons learned. Excuse me. With North Korea, we learned a couple lessons. We need to have maintain the punitive measures while we negotiate. We also need to have very precise language, like we had with the Soviet Union on arms control. Prevent the loopholes, identify the responsibilities of all the parties, so that way we can make progress and not have disputes. And also we need to, eventually get to a point where we have a very sufficient and vigorous verification process. I used to work arms control. I was on one of the negotiating delegations overseas, and so we need to identify things such as short notice challenge inspections of non-declared facilities, technical sampling, et cetera. So, we just need to have sort of a very precise contract rather than what we saw with the six-party talks was, in the interest of keeping things going, which was seen as success, having vague text so that everyone could have their own interpretation, which, as the U.S. negotiator said, we have to keep the bicycle moving forward, otherwise it falls over. Well, the problem is you can only keep that facade going for so long. Eventually, you're going to have a disagreement, and we saw North Korea having, very different interpretations of what was covered. So I think as we look to negotiating with Iran, we just have to have very careful, very precise text that eventually will have a very sufficient verification process.
Thank you. Please.
Several months ago, there was a report that a public opinion poll taken in ROK had a majority of the respondents favoring the development of an independent nuclear deterrent capability by the ROK. I was wondering if you've heard any further developments along those lines.
I saw the polls. I think they were a bit misleading in that the poll was taken shortly after North Korea's nuclear test. And also in my discussions with Korean officials, Korean public, Korean journalists, I didn't get a sense as strong a support as came out in that one poll. There are really two proposals. One is reintroduction of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. The other is South Korea developing their own nuclear weapon. On the U.S. weapon, quite simply, we don't have the weapons that we removed in the early 1990s. The tactical ground force weapons, we don't use those anymore. And the U.S. view would be we can do the job of deterrence and extended deterrence guarantee quite well with the naval-based and air-based nuclear weapons. If we put nuclear weapons into South Korea, there's no military purpose for it. And also, in a way, it makes it a much bigger preemptive target for North Korea. And also, I think, given South Korea's political situation, it would generate huge protests in South Korea, really for no purpose. We can do the deterrence and defeat capabilities offshore. As for South Korea developing a nuclear weapon, I don't think there would really be a strong public support for that. And I think it really, although I can understand the rationale for it, given that North Korea has nuclear weapons, I think it would divert attention away from North Korea's threat and allow people to depict South Korea as the problem. So I'm not in favor of either reintroducing U.S. nukes onto South Korean soil or South Korea developing weapons.
So if this is just the question of adjustment, where would you see it? You said that punitive measures not enough. Well, I mean, you know the case of North Korea. I mean, they turn their weaknesses into their strengths. Mm-hmm. Total isolation, double isolation from inside and outside, a total information vacuum, control that's unparalleled to any other place in today's world, some other things. So all these measures that put in place by the Security Council, by individual member states, they are actually, the logic is to work in the environment that is similar to the environment where other countries operate, but it's not the case. It's one of the reasons it doesn't work. What would you change? Seriously, I know you think about it. I know that you are one of the most serious people on this thing, and I really appreciate your view on that.
Thank you, Sasha.
I wish I could solve North Korea in the next 30 seconds. A lot of people have been focusing on it. I think actually not just 20 years. We need to move the timeline back. Is North Korea has been pursuing a nuclear weapons program since the 1960s, a plutonium-based. They've been pursuing a uranium-based program since the late 1980s or the early 1990s. The U.S., South Korea, and others have tried a variety of policies. But the one consistent thing has been North Korea has always continued its quest for nuclear weapons. So I never thought they were building a negotiating chip. They didn't spend billions or trillions of dollars, devote decades of effort and risk international isolation simply to build something they were wanting to give up. So, I mean, that is their quest. That has been their quest for decades. We are trying to deter, prevent, constrain that quest, but we have been unsuccessful. Now, I disagree with people that blame the U.S. or blame South Korea that North Korea has nuclear weapons. I blame North Korea. They're the ones who are pursuing it. And so when we try to constrain or denuclearize them, we've tried engagement. And North Korea, I mean, they signed 4 international agreements never to pursue nuclear weapons. Then they've now signed 3 agreements to give up the weapons that they promised never to build in the first place. So in a way, we're simply trying to get them to live up to their signature on 7 or more international agreements, 8, I guess, if you count the Leap Day agreement. And so we've tried a variety of ways. We've tried engagement. Under Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Bill Clinton, it was just really unconditional engagement. That didn't work. They continued the uranium enrichment project. So we are trying to stop a country that is very determined to have nuclear weapons. So, you know, we've right now really in Washington, there's little interest or incentive for engagement because the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration feel they've tried. The Leap Day Agreement was simply trying to get North Korea to begin to live up to its many commitments in return for some food. They gave that up 2 weeks later with their announcement. So I think you know, we are still trying to get them to denuclearize, but we're trying to do it, you know, really in a way that's very difficult to achieve. So, you know, as I've said, you know, I don't think we should be afraid of engaging them. I think we can have bilateral talks, you know, anytime. You know, I'm hesitant about going back to 6-party talks until they at least give us a hint they're willing to denuclearize. But also the sanctions. You know, many people say sanctions have not worked because North Korea didn't give up the weapons. Well, neither did Sunshine Policy. And I'd argue, actually, there are a number of objectives for sanctions. One is to uphold the law. If you're not going to uphold the law or UN resolutions, they're worthless. 2 is to impose a penalty on countries that do violate international law or UN Security Council resolutions. 3 is you're trying to put in place measures that will constrain, if not prevent, the inflow of money from illicit activities, components, technology for their nuclear and missile programs. 4, you're trying to prevent or at least constrain proliferation. And 5, you're trying to get them to change their behavior and to give up their nuclear weapons. I'd argue on 4 of the 5, even the limited sanctions we put into place have been successful to some degree. And I think we've been timid in those in that we haven't implemented enough in order to try to influence North Korea to come back to the talks to begin coming up or abiding by their commitments. You know, there's no magic bullet. There's no magic Rubik's Cube combination of benefits that we haven't tried before that will get North Korea to say, that's it. If you'd only offered that 50 years ago, we never would have built them. I think we're, you know, in a very difficult situation where we're doing the best we can. But as I said before, I think the Obama administration has generally a good policy. It's just been very weakly implemented on each of the 3 tracks.
Thank you, Bruce. And we'll have a chance in just a moment to thank Bruce properly. But I did want to take the moment to invite you all back here on December 10th for the release or re-release of The Two Koreas with Bob Carlin. Bob, who is a senior analyst on Asia, known to many in this room, spent a tremendous amount of time with Don Oberdorfer, the author of The Two Koreas, and has taken this all-important work and gone throughout it to bring it very current. And so we're very pleased on the day of its national release to have him here at the Korea Society. That's December 10th. And if you are interested, on December 13th in the morning, we have a special session for a limited number of people on China, Korea, U.S. relations, the evolving trilateral dynamics with some of this nation's top experts, as well as representatives from China and from Korea. So do take a look at koreasociety.org. If you're not a member already, we would love to have you as a member. I would like to thank Nikki of our policy team, as well as Peter from our media department and the entire group here at the Korea Society. And please help me in thanking Bruce Klingner, Senior Analyst on Asia. Bruce, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.